So we know that one of your previous presidents initiated the New Deal during the Great Depression to lessen the detrimental effects of the recession. And they have different programs, public work projects, and financial reforms under the New Deal. However, according to research, different racial ethnic groups were affected differently by the New Deal. And some of them are manifestations of institutional racism. And if we scroll down to the headings that says African Americans and the New Deal, and the President Roosevelt, initiated the Civilian Conservation Corps and the Work Progress Administration to provide employment to everybody affected by the recession, including Blacks and African Americans. And it seemed that Black artists, writers, and musicians, they benefited from the Work Progress Administration. And they were able to promote Black history, Black culture, among other things during this time. And this WPA created jobs for Blacks. It's part of the New Deal, CCC and WPA. But not all programs under the New Deal benefited the Blacks and African Americans. The National Recovery Administration, or NRA, and the Agricultural Adjustment Act, or AAA. Their purpose was to stabilize industry and support farmers. But they worked to the detriment of Black workers and sharecroppers. I wonder if these Black workers and sharecroppers, they did not own their own farms, so maybe they were not considered farmers during that time. And because of that, they did not qualify for NRA and AAA. And this can be a manifestation of institutional racism. Blacks were being disadvantaged and is being embedded into the structure of the society or any government or economic institution. In this case, the AAA and the NRA. They promoted fair wages and work-life balance through working hours. And they try to minimize racial differences in wages. But it seems that these programs did not benefit the Blacks for some reason. And AAA also had policies on crop reduction to stabilize crop pricing and pricing of other agricultural products. And I wonder if, because Blacks, sharecroppers, and Black workers were not considered farmers, maybe they rented their lands and they did not own land themselves. And because of that, they did not benefit from any of these programs under the New Deal. So it can be an unequal treatment between different racial ethnic groups. It can be a manifestation of institutional racism. And Because of this, different programs under the New Deal eventually gave momentum to the civil rights movement in the 60s. Maybe Black leaders and other Black population, maybe they joined force and they had support from people from other racial ethnic groups to fight for equality, especially interracial equality. So, some programs under the New Deal spearheaded the civil rights movement, according to the author of this article. And let's see how Latino Americans were affected by the New Deal. And the New Deal led to mixed effects on Hispanics and Latinos. And it seemed that Mexican Americans were the first to go under the New Deal during the Great Depression. When times were bad, they were the first to go. And when times were good, they were also the first to get hired when there weren't enough workers on the farms. It was the most convenient way, the easiest way to get laborers from neighboring countries, especially Mexico and other Central and Latin American countries. And too bad, so sad, they were also the first one to be let go during recession. So this can be a manifestation of institutional racism. This kind of racism, certain people are being let go. When times are bad, it could be embedded in the structure of the economic institutions, different entities that create and distribute jobs, whether it's a farm, it's a factory, or other business entities. And this kind of racism is also embedded in the government agencies or different political institutions. They did not have any laws or ordinances that prevented people from certain racial ethnic groups to be let go when times were bad. Sometimes it had nothing to do with them being unskillful or unproductive. But the CCC and WPA provided employment opportunities to Latinos. So some were affected in a positive manner through programs under the New Deal, and some were being let go first when times were bad. But even though the purposes of CCC and WPA was to create jobs during the recession, but maybe these entities did not safeguard fair income and fair wages. So Latinos were being paid at a lower wage. It's also a manifestation of institutional discrimination or institutional racism. Because this kind of racism was embedded in the structure of government entities like the CCC and WPA, or in the structures of different economic institutions, different employers. They could pay ethnic minorities a lower wage. So it's also a manifestation of institutional racism. And some of the Mexicans were being sent back during the recession when they weren't needed. They were being deported essentially. And according to some of the researchers not listed in this article, some of the Mexicans or Mexican Americans who were being deported back or repatriated back. Some were permanent residents, some were citizens of the country. They were legal in this country. So this can also be a manifestation of institutional racism. They deported people from certain racial ethnic backgrounds back to their countries of origin when times were bad. This kind of racism was embedded in the structures of the political institution and the economic institution. But the New Deal also promoted labor rights under the Wagner Act. And because of that, this Wagner Act could have benefited and protected Latino workers and workers from other racial ethnic groups. And Latinos and Hispanics could organize, could form unions under this Wagner Act. So Latinos and Hispanics were affected in different ways under different programs of the New Deal. It's not entirely a manifestation of institutional racism for Hispanics and Latinos. And what about Native Americans and American Indians? During the Great Depression and partly under the New Deal, they formed the Indian Reorganization Act or IRA in 1934. And this IRA is or was different from the Dawes Act of 1887. This Dawes Act, it seems that they focus on assimilating American Indians or Native Americans into the mainstream culture. And this IRA was also called the Wheeler-Howard Act, and it has different components. And it focused on tribal self-governance, which gave Native Americans and American Indians more autonomy, and they could create their own constitution. So it seemed that they weren't affected by institutional racism under the New Deal. Maybe yes, prior to the New Deal, under the 1887 Dawes Act. But things improved somewhat under IRA. So they could manage their own affairs. They could self-govern. And this IRA also focused on economic revitalization. And because of that, Native Americans and American Indians could promote their arts and craft, among other things. And they could also purchase land. They had more autonomy in terms of land ownership. But IRA still focused on Western forms of governance, and not every Native Americans or American Indians like that. They considered their culture being marginalized under IRA. So depends on how you perceive this paragraph. It can or cannot be a manifestation of institutional racism. And the CCC also benefited Native Americans and American Indians by creating job opportunities and by developing the reservations and other infrastructure. And the CCC also built schools, hospitals, and other infrastructure in different Native American communities. So it seems that they weren't affected by institutional racism to the extent of what Mexicans, Hispanics, Latinos, Blacks, and African Americans experienced during the New Deal, during the Great Depression. So, different programs under the New Deal affected people from different racial ethnic groups differently. And let's focus on Asian Americans. And some Asian Americans, especially those who came from China and Japan, they were affected by the exclusionary laws even before the Great Depression. And they were affected by prejudicial behaviors, racism, and discrimination. They were affected by the Chinese Exclusion Act. This is a manifestation of institutional racism, even though it was instituted before the New Deal. This kind of racism, excluding Asian Americans, especially those from China, to come to the US during the late 19th century, is a kind of discrimination or racism embedded in the political institution, in the government. The same with the Immigration Act of 1924 that prevented Asians from migrating to the US and prevented Asians from becoming US citizens. So this Immigration Act of 1924 can be a manifestation of institutional racism, is embedded in the structure of the government. So Asians were affected by the recession as well during the Great Depression. And WPA and CCC, they did not exclude Asian Americans. And some of these Asian Americans actually benefited from these two programs. So they weren't affected by institutional racism through the WPA and CCC for Asian Americans, unlike other racial ethnic groups. But maybe these two programs did not focus on, or did not emphasize, or did not include wage control or fair wages for people of all groups, whether it's gender groups, racial groups, or age groups, or other kinds of criteria. And because of that, Asian Americans were paid at a lower wage, even though they benefited from the WPA and CCC. If they were being paid at a lower wage and it did not have anything to do with their skills and expertise and experience, this would be a manifestation of institutional racism. And some of the Asian Americans, after some time in the US, they saved enough money, they started their own businesses, and they started their own farms as well. But they were affected by the Great Depression as well. And some policies discriminated against the Asians at the government levels, at the state and local levels of governance. And because of that, Asian-owned businesses were under immense pressure during the Great Depression. So this can be a manifestation of institutional racism. If businesses owned by other racial ethnic groups weren't affected in the same manner, then it would be a manifestation of institutional racism during the New Deal. And the Chinese Exclusion Act was repealed in 1943. So the detrimental effects of institutional racism lessened for Asian Americans in the 40s. But they weren't affected that much because the quota only slightly increased. So they weren't affected that much, even though this act was repealed in the 40s.